Hi, this is Siofra's Magic Alcove, and I'm Siofra Bradigan. So, I want to talk about taking personal responsibility in this video because it's a huge part of our path. That's sort of the whole point of not being a member of another religious order or, a church group or specific kind of religious texts and so forth, is that then we become personally responsible for our actions and the consequences that we have for those actions. And so it has come to my attention recently that it's probably a good subject just to try and clarify some things with. Trying to think about how to approach this. First off, if you're going to take personal responsibility for something, some action that you've taken, you have to first know that the action you've taken was not a good action. So being able to recognize things that are inappropriate or, not good, not positive, not in your best interest, not in your spiritual development's best interest, and so forth, is definitely, you have to sort of decide for yourself. Um, but taking personal responsibility does not mean that you're giving other people a clean slate and that they're not also responsible for their actions, reactions, etc. In order to decide what action is good for you, you have to do a lot of thinking. You have to consider consequences of what you've already done in the past and so forth, and then why those consequences happen. Some of the examples, well, one of the ones we've talked about previously is the inadvisability of doing a love spell. This sort of goes to a basic idea and concept that what you start something with, how you start something, can color the relationship, the activity, the results from that point on. It's sort of the seed. When you think about starting something new, what you put together as that new thing, the seed of it, if you have something in there that is not good for your growth, its growth, whatever, um, what you're going to end up with is something that isn't going to work. It might work in the short term, but in the long term, it's not going to. So, like with doing love spells, first thing that comes to mind is how do you know if it works? Let's say you've done a love spell and it works in your mind. Does the person that you're attracted to is now attracted to you and you get together? But the question at the core of the relationship is why? Are they in the relationship with you because you did a love spell? And if they hadn't been influenced by your magic, would they still want to be in a relationship with you? What happens if and when they find out that you've performed a magical spell in order to sway them in your direction? You're starting a relationship not with honesty, but on deceit. You're trying to go around um, their their will and make a decision on their behalf instead of honoring their right to make a decision on their own. That's sort of the idea of how you can start to figure out when things aren't good. But it doesn't mean that because you make a mistake, doomed for all time. If you learn from the mistake, that can help mitigate your consequences. So if you've done something that you think is not okay and you tell the person what you've done, you have to accept the consequences of their reaction to what you're confessing to and their right to choose to not have a relationship with you anymore and to honor their boundaries because boundaries are definitely a part of this. So it brings up the idea of making amends and apologies and all the other stuff and learning from mistakes. And I think, for me, it took a long time to get to the point where I was okay with acknowledging that I made a mistake, because for me, my childhood, one of my survival tactics that I used, was trying to be perfect. I had it in my head that if I was perfect, then everything around me would be perfect, and then no one would fight, no bad things would happen, and therefore, when bad things did happen and people fought, I felt it was my fault. And so admitting that I wasn't perfect was like this ginormous block in my head. It's like, wow, that was like not okay. So learning how to apologize was very difficult for me. And admitting, the first step into apologizing is admitting that you've made a mistake. And for some people, this is a big, like a giant barricade. It seems like a mountain. And really, it's not. It's just a little bump in the road once you accept the fact that people make mistakes and all of us are human and none of us is perfect. And the whole point of this isn't to become perfect in the sense that nothing ever goes wrong, because the universe is full of chaos and challenges. And that's just sort of the way life is. That's the way things are arranged. That's the processes that we have set in place in order for things to continually move in different directions, move forward, get rid of stuff that doesn't belong, destroy it in a giant fire or whatever. I mean, it's like if our mindset is such that we think we have failed as a magic user or a witch or a pagan or a human, if something doesn't go our way, then we're setting ourselves up for some big, huge disappointments down the road. Because, in my opinion, that is not how magic works. Magic is about going with the flow, figuring out what direction things are going. There's only certain things that you can control, and yourself is really the only one. How you respond or react to any given situation determines, in a large to a large extent, the outcome, whether it's going to be a positive or negative outcome. And the more we battle and fight against the reality that we find ourselves in, and try and power our way through and insist that it be our way, the longer it takes for us to come to these realizations. I remember times when I would be screaming at the universe and yelling at them for doing all these terrible things to me. Yeah. And and I was very decidedly upset. um, Rage is a good thing. I mean, you can use rage to your advantage, getting it out and not harboring it, not aiming it at someone who doesn't deserve it, uh, taking and owning your own part. These are the important parts. But so if you can do some primal screaming somewhere where you're not going to get the police called on you because they think you're being murdered, it's a good thing to do, because we have a lot of that kind of stuff pent up, frustration and angst or whatever. And depending on our age and how long we've been at it, that can have an effect too, because certainly hormones affect our emotions hugely. Depending on what stage of physical development we're in, that can affect our ability to deal with some of these kinds of issues. It's just about learning and time. So getting to the point where it's okay to make mistakes and to apologize for them. Thinking, I was going through a lot of this when I was living at the Blue Zoo in Santa Cruz. And it was a communal house. I've talked about this a few times. We had 7 bedrooms and had as like 10 housemates. Um, yeah, so potential conflict, rubbing people the wrong way, was pretty much a guarantee with that many people living in a house. People have different focuses, like what they think is important. And some of the things that I thought were important were not the same as some of the things other people thought were important. And so I failed their sense of what was important. They failed mine. Figuring out how to deal with that in itself was an interesting exercise. And it was while I was living there that I went into therapy and started to unpack some of the stuff that happened to me as a child, and found out really that perfectionism that I had and what that was based on and why that was there, starting to recognize some of my own traits and starting to decide what I wanted to change about myself and apply my changes in a real life situation. So when I was first there, um, when I started going into therapy, I started to realize that being able to say I'm sorry was a big thing for me. Learning how to do that and to admit when I said something that was incorrect or um, inappropriate or what have you. And the house had its tactics, formats, and so forth that it used. We had like meetings once a week. We did everything by consensus. Um, I talked about a little bit about that on my video on what consensus is, if you want to know more about that process. So we had a structure that was set up for clearing the air and for letting people know, sort of a formal structure. And then everybody could, take responsibility for their own part. That's how you're supposed to do it. Take responsibility for how you feel instead of projecting how you think the other person is acting onto them. But, you know, this happened and this is how I felt. So you're owning your emotions and your feelings, which is important. If you don't own them, no one's going to know what they are. If you can't learn what they are called, that makes it more difficult. And I think that those of us who come from an incredibly abusive background, that is another one of those challenges, being able to identify emotions, both good and bad emotions, because we basically only have experience with bad ones. There's a few good ones that I have from my childhood, but they're few and far between. So being able to identify the range of emotions and accept them for what they are is part of this process. Because if you're going to become yourself, you have to clear out I don't know, the twigs and the vines and things like that other people have wrapped around you and that you've put in your own way to protect yourself. So it's like an unveiling, an uncluttering of all these responses that you've developed to protect yourself and to survive whatever it was that happened. And I can't imagine what it would be like for someone to be raised in a healthy household, since that didn't happen to me. I mean, I have an idea of what it might be like, but I can't really know that because that's not what I experienced. I can imagine that that would mean that those people might not have the same kind of challenges. But then I met someone when I was up in the Kispiox Valley who had what she said was a very happy home life, and she ended up getting together with the wrong kind of men. In the beginning, she didn't. She had a really good partner that she connected with a lot, and he was tragically killed in an accident. And that kind of threw a wrench in her works for the rest of her life. Um, and she did not know how to respond to that. So there's no like, it's a bad life if this happens to you, it's a good life if this happens or doesn't happen to you. It's still a matter of how you are able to process and respond to the situations that arise, which are unpredictable in most cases. So, I know, like when Ian and I first got together, the first 5 years were somewhat traumatic for me because I wasn't used to being in a house where there wasn't fighting all the time, although I hated fighting. I mean, I really didn't want to be around fighting. But then when I wasn't around fighting, it felt strange, alien, uncertain. Like, what the heck is this? And I kept waiting for something terrible to happen, which was funny in retrospect. Every time he said he had something really important he wanted to tell me, I was sure we were breaking up. That was my expectation. And then he said something really wonderful and sweet. you know, hmm. And I'd never been in a relationship for longer than 5 years. So when we hit the 5 year mark, I kind of freaked out getting past that hurdle. So we have these anniversary kind of things too. Becoming conscious, I knew then what was happening. So I was able to tell him, I'm freaking out because I've never made it past 5 years and my brain is trying to think of why this isn't going to work. And I'm imagining you're having an affair with somebody and blah, 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 blah. All these things. But I was able to express it and let him know how I felt. And that communication is a really important part of this whole process of taking personal responsibility. Like, not telling him that he's making me feel this way. I know that this is coming from my internal processes. And, that doesn't mean that some things might not happen that weren't. And that's that ability to discern the difference between someone's actually being an ass and it's not okay and you can't let them continue like that, or you're reacting to something because of something that happened in the past and it triggered a memory and an emotional response that you have forgotten about, and now you're focused on the person in front of you and you're projecting all of that experienced rage or fear or whatever it is onto the person who's standing, and they are like taking the place of the person who really deserved that energy. And I think that was one of the things that helped me in the therapy, um, was being able to give back to the people who deserved to take that back, the energy that the things that they had done to me, like my father. Because I was a child, I had no power, no control, I had no choice. Things were done to me, and I had to figure out how to survive those things. But the rage and and the guilt and all the other stuff that came along with that wasn't mine to carry. It belonged to the person who abused me, and in this case, my father mostly. And so, writing him a letter, um, telling him exactly how I felt, sending it to him and the entire family. I never do things half-heartedly. Apparently, the the therapist says if you want him to read the letter, tell him you're sending it to everyone else, and then he'll have to read it so he knows what it says. And I'm like, well, why shouldn't they get this letter too? So I went ahead and did it. I'm a rabble rouser. Destruction. Yes, I was tired of being the black sheep that everybody dumped stuff on and being responsible for all this stuff. So I laid it out, and people had some visceral and not positive reactions to that. I figured that was on them. So you have your responsibility for something, but then it's not taking on someone else's stuff. It's just taking on your stuff, your part, what you can do, how you can change, what needs to happen internally for you to be able to deal with it. If that means leaving the situation, leaving the person, um, going into therapy, which I highly recommend because it really helps you identify some of these, if you find the right therapist, obviously. Like everything else, crapshoot. You have to just keep on trying. Just because one doesn't work doesn't mean they're all bad. Um, and and taking care of yourself and being kind to yourself and forgiving yourself for not knowing everything, because you don't know something until you become aware of it. There's no um, there's nothing that is out there that says at this age you're going to know this, at this age you're going to know that. You should know all these things by now. It depends upon your life experiences, the culture you're in, the things that are around you, the all of that stuff. And whatever it is that you don't know it. Yes, that's the thing, is you don't know what you don't know because you don't know. You can't know. And when you become aware of it, beating yourself in the head for not knowing it sooner doesn't do you any good. So when you learn something about yourself that you don't like, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing, because you can't change something if you don't know it exists. That's part of it. Like, you can't take personal responsibility for your own actions if you don't know what you're responsible for. And what your own actions mean to other people. So let's say you made a big, huge faux pas of some kind and you need to apologize. Some people don't understand what that means, how you apologize for something you've done. For one, a genuine apology is not, I'm sorry for what I did to you, but, and then an explanation of why you did it. That's not an apology. That is trying to make them part of the situation. It's like not you, it's a situation. Um, it's something that happened to me, therefore I like blurted it out on you, but it was somehow not my fault because this thing happened to me and I'm not completely responsible because I was out of my mind. That isn't that doesn't work. That's not an apology. An apology is a complete and total acceptance of your part and an acknowledgement that you've done something that hurt someone else or violated their boundaries, um, and so forth. And you can't do that and then expect a certain result. I mean, the other person has every right to decide, okay, I've accepted your apology. That does not mean I want to continue to have a relationship. It's not their job to make you okay. That's your job. You have to come to terms with what happened and what you learned and move on. And in some cases, you will be able to have a continuing relationship with the individual. It depends on how big the egregious behavior happens to be. But in other cases, it's damage beyond repair for the other person. And they have every right to choose not to have anything to do with you. And that's the thing, is like no has the power when it comes to relationships. And it drives me crazy when I'm watching TV shows and all the rom-coms and so forth. They all start out with a couple who meet each other, can't stand each other, are constantly fighting, and then discover they love each other. And the woman mostly is reluctant to do anything with the guy, and he just keeps on insisting, insisting, keeps on asking and pushing and pushing. And so she finally says yes, and then she realizes he was the love of her life, and what was she waiting for, blah, blah, blah. That annoys the living daylights out of me because that is the wrong message for us to get. The message should be a person said, I'm not interested, and the response is, okay, if you change your mind, I'm here, but if not, that's fine. It's entirely up to you. And leave it and move on to different people, different situations, whatever it happens to be. So, acknowledging what you've done does not mean you get what you want. I guess that's what I'm trying to lead to. If you're apologizing to someone as a form of manipulation to make them forgive you so that you can keep on going, that's not a genuine apology. That's not an acknowledgement of what you've done and an acceptance of their autonomy to decide what they want to do. It's a form of manipulation. It's an attempt to manipulate their feelings, either make them feel sorry for you, make them feel guilty about how they mistreated you, which led you to the bad behavior that you had. These are not apologies. These are a complete ego thing, and has not what we're trying to talk about. Some things, you know, that can happen, they can't be undone. If it's a physical thing, it can't be undone. If you can't fix it, the only thing you can do is move on, move forward, and learn from the mistake you made, and do your best to not make that mistake again. And I have that's sort of been my personal ideal philosophy for a long time. Like horrific things happened to me when I was a child. I mean, torment and torture and all levels of mental and physical and sexual abuse. And I had nothing, no say in it. And I was actually thinking about that today, ironically, before I sat down, how one time I was uh, I was standing at a bus stop in Washington D.C. waiting for the bus, and someone put their hand up my skirt and grabbed my crotch, and then it was over in a fraction of a second. And I spun around, and there were two men who were close enough to me to have done it, but I didn't know which one had done it, and I wanted to kick them both, and maybe everyone else who was nearby, to get the person who did it, but I felt I couldn't do that because I didn't want to kick the wrong person. And I left the bus stop. I went into a bathroom and I threw up. And that is a visceral reaction to not being able to take appropriate action in a situation. I was violated. Somebody might not think that that was a big deal, but it was without my permission, violated my boundaries, violated my personal space, did it certainly without permission, and knew they were doing something wrong because they hid who they were after the fact. So sometimes there's nothing you can do in the moment except whatever you can, to keep yourself safe. But it was kind of interesting just thinking about that today, and how instantaneous it was, the feeling sick to my stomach, because by then I'd gotten out of the habit of stuffing my feelings. And I think that's the other thing. Like for me, I was trained as a child and a young adult to not allow myself to have whatever feelings I had. It was not safe to have feelings. I couldn't show them. If my father saw me having a thought that he thought was bad, I was in trouble. Um, and we're thinking, bad? What kind of bad thoughts could you have when you were a kid? Apparently, not having the right look on your face and not saying good night in the right tone of voice and saying I love you and kissing him on the cheek properly was one of those things that sometimes I had to do 20 or 30 times in an evening before I was allowed to actually go to bed, because that was part of my training. It was clearly, in retrospect, training me to behave a certain way, to have a certain look on my face and so forth. So getting to the point where you can actually have your own feelings is weird, to say the least. And figuring out what those feelings are, like I said earlier, it's like identifying what kind of feelings you're having. So, being able to have those feelings, learned to the point where I could have those feelings, untrained that aspect of my personality, so that when I feel something, I feel it. It's like deciding what I'm going to do about it is a different issue, but I feel whatever it is. And I had that really driven home when my mother came to visit me right after Ian and I got together. We'd only been together for like a couple months, I think, at that point, maybe even a month. We had this trip planned, and my mother was coming, and we went down to Santa Cruz for her to take a harp class from this guy. Anyway, she was there, and she arrived, and and she didn't respect my boundaries. She felt, I guess, as my mother, that she wasn't required to, because as my mother, she would know better what I needed. That sort of idea, I think. And she handed me a group of pictures from the family, and I started looking through them. And while I'm looking through these pictures, she's talking about my one of my other sister, one of my sisters. I've got two sisters, not the youngest one, but the middle one. Um, Having forgiven the uncle that molested us, and forgiven my father for what he did, and how great she thought that was, that she had done that, and how she really was hoping that I would be able to do that, because she felt that my anger was hurting me and I needed to let it go, which was the subtext she didn't quite say because she's not that good of a communicator, but it was pretty obvious what she was talking about. So while she's saying this in my ear, I'm looking through these pictures, and there's a picture of the uncle that molested me. And I feel like I've just been hit with a brick. I'm in shock. I was not expecting this. I wasn't ready for this. I didn't ask for it, and I certainly would have said, "Don't show this to me," if someone had asked, which she didn't. And she hid it amongst the pictures, so she knew she was being bad, in my opinion. Otherwise, it would have been on top, and it wouldn't have been hidden in there. And the droning voice that she was giving me about, forgiveness and stuff like that wouldn't have been part of the conversation. And I tried to swallow my feelings. I tried doing dishes as she was continuing to drone on about this, as I was in shock and trying to figure out how to process. Um, and I had this giant lump in my stomach, and I could feel it climbing up my throat, literally. It was like this thing, just feeling a dense packet of stuff. And it was just like coming up into the back of my throat, and I kept trying to like not let it out, and I finally couldn't take it anymore. And I turned to my mother and I said, "Mother, shut up." And she was astonished by my rudeness. She said, "Excuse me?" I said, "Shut up. Now here are the rules. You can talk about my sister all you want and how great her life is, but nothing more about how she's forgiven everybody who ever hurt her. That's off limits. Anything else is fine. And I never want to see a picture of Uncle Bob ever again. Period. Do you understand me?" She said, "Yes." And then I walked into my bedroom and cried for an hour. And Ian followed me and held me, which I thought was very brave and perfect. Sometimes when you're going through something, you don't need anyone to ask you what's happening or to try and explain it. You just need someone to witness and be present in the moment with you and to acknowledge what's going on. Okay, apparently that got somewhere. Whew. All right, so um, I had learned how to stand up for myself. I had learned what a boundary was. I had noticed when that boundary was crossed, and even though she was my mother, I held her to account. And I don't know if she actually ever understood that or apologized for it, but I didn't care. It was just I needed to do that. And I didn't forget it. I mean, that told me I couldn't trust her with my heart. Um, I had to be my own advocate, even with my own mother. It's something that sort of comes at you um, subliminally, that your mother's someone you can trust, or your parents, or whatever. And it's not true in some cases. Some cases it must be true. I'm sure there's some wonderful mothers out there, but they're all human too, still. So when she came to visit me the next time, after Ian and I had been together for a while, we actually moved out here to the coast, and she brought more pictures from the same family grouping where my uncle was, um, and went to hand them to me. And I said, "Is there a picture of my Uncle Bob in this?" She says, "No." I said, "Okay." So then I took them, and she didn't lie. There was no picture of my uncle in there. It was good. And then she's telling me about her trip, and he had emphysema. He was on oxygen and all this other stuff. He was so frail, he couldn't have hurt anybody at that point. She's telling me all this stuff. And I said, "Good. If anyone ever deserved a slow and lingering death, it's him." And then she let out this like, and I'm like, "That's funny." And I thought to myself, you are not in touch with your rage like you should be, because you should be in touch with the fact that it's okay for me to be angry about what he did to me and not care about his health or anything else. Like this idea that we have to forgive the people who abused us and give them more grace than they've ever given us, I think is just a crock. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. It's not your responsibility to soothe them. Your responsibility is to protect yourself, set your own boundaries, and take responsibility for your own actions. Easier said than done. But that's what you're responsible for, not for their reaction to you doing that for yourself if they don't like it. And sometimes, it leads to families not being as close. Sometimes people are able to work through that. At this point, my mother and I have got sort of a distance kind of relationship, which is fine. We talk on the phone. We don't talk about anything earth shattering. She's now 94. And any processing that she was going to do, she's done at this point, and that's fine. I'm okay with letting all of that stuff go, as far as, like, I don't have to confront her. But I did at the time. when it happened. And I don't know what she learned from that. I don't know. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. Um, we often have this idea in our head that we're supposed to be able to have a different kind of relationship with certain people, and either they're going to be better behaved or not. When I was living with my second husband, Rick, that's my daughter's father, and he was like punching holes in the wall and stuff when he wanted to hit me, but he hit the wall instead and broke his hand through it. Didn't break his hand. I kept hoping he would, but that didn't happen. Because that'd be a good consequence. Punching a wall, breaking a hand, direct karma. But no. But I knew exactly what he was thinking when he did that because of when he did it, stuff like that. One of the things that he said to me was that he felt like when he would say something mean, verbally assaultive to me when he came home from work, and I would say something about it, say that doesn't, that's not nice. It makes me feel bad. Shouldn't be talking to me that way. He would say, when I come home from work, I want to be able to relax and just be myself. I shouldn't have to watch every word I say and how I act when I'm at home. And it's like so the opposite of how I felt about a relationship. I feel like if you're in a good, loving relationship, you should always be on your best behavior with the person you care the most about, and you should treat them better than anyone else on the planet, not worse. We were like, way far apart when it came to that. So no big surprise when we got a divorce. Then he got together with a woman who, a good Christian woman, and does whatever she's supposed to. They've been together ever since. Got 4 children, 4 daughters. Yeah, I think they've got 4 daughters. Um, but you know, that's just sort of an example of abuse and how it works. And I know that some of you are going to be in those kind of relationships and think that somehow it's your fault. Because that's what an abuser will tell you. They will tell you that it's your fault, that you're asking too much of them, that your expectations are too high, that no one could actually be as good as that, that you know what sets them off. And if you would just stop doing that one behavior, you wouldn't get into trouble and, you know, could stop it before it starts because they're not taking responsibility for their actions. That's how those things work, is to make it all about you. So if that's happening to you, please go get help immediately if you can. Um, go talk to somebody. Those are red flags. But on the magical end of things, we build our relationship with the universe by how we behave and how we communicate with the universe. The universe is constantly listening in its own way and responding to everything we do. So if we allow someone to abuse us, it's harder for us to get out of abusive relationships because the universe thinks that's what we want. It doesn't make a judgment call. The universe isn't there to make a judgment call. It doesn't say this is bad, this is good, just like this is, and this is where you are, and this is what you're doing, and these are the choices that you're making, so this must be what you want. So we have to like educate the universe when we decide to change what we're willing to accept. And it takes a while for it, to catch up to us. Think of it as like a lake, a small lake that you've put a pond. Let's make it a pond. It'll be easier to imagine it's a pond. That you've put all these experiences into the things that have happened to you and that you've accepted and so forth, and now you've looked at that and it's kind of murky and icky and you don't like it and you want to change it. So then you're going to start taking the icky stuff out and trying to process it and put it somewhere else. But for a while, when you're doing that, it's going to stay icky and murky and cloudy, and that's the part that the universe is responding to. So every time you're faced with a choice, I don't care how big or how small, the universe is watching that choice and decides what you want to see based on your choice. Before Ian and I got together, I had been with men who were not good for me, men who were like my father, who couldn't love and were abusive. And I was attracted to that kind of man because I was trying to change my father's mind about me and make him see I was worth something. And since he wasn't around anymore, I had to do it through a proxy. They became my proxies. So just before Ian and I met, really, and had our date that he never left from, never left my house from again, um, they gave me another man who was very similar to all the other men. One who was like intense and moody and uh, sort of weirdly charismatic, kind of focused or what have you. And it was like the universe was like, well, we've presented you with this kind of person. And every time we've presented you with this kind of person, you've taken them. So are you sure that this isn't what you want? And so I was very sure at that point that that was no longer what I wanted. And so I had a chat with the universe and said, you know what? No, even if he is interested in us, I'm not interested in him. And so it's a solid no. So when we went on our double date, I had already decided I wasn't interested in him that way at all. And he was seriously interested in the other woman who went with us, so that was a relief. I was like, yay! I don't have to break up with him. Because we're also trained not to hurt people's feelings. And it's like, yep, yeah, got to watch out for that. There's a lot of training that, especially women, but most people go through about that kind of stuff. It's like ingrained, pops up. You go like, wait a minute. Why should I care about this in particular? Is this really that important? I mean, really, is it my responsibility to do that? And, with the other kinds of relationships I've had before then, like the guy that took me from Canada back down to Santa Cruz when I first arrived in Santa Cruz, I was with this guy who turned into like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Mr. Hyde came out and he was like, way not okay. Um, and he would be mean to me, like, and say cutting, vicious things, and call me names, and then want to have sex at night. And I was like, so not interested at that point at all. It's like, I'm sorry, what? So at least I was getting some boundaries at that point. But yeah, it's like you just go like, just because a person says something to you doesn't mean it's true. Just because a person wants something from you doesn't mean you have to give it. Just because you want something from them doesn't mean that they're obligated to give it to you. It works both ways. So, genuine apology, acknowledge what you did. This is what I did, and I'm sorry that I did this. And as an added bonus, I am going to learn from what I've done to you and not do this to anyone else. And if you never want to talk to me again, that's your right. And I will not argue with you and will not try to push your boundaries and try and contact you to make you see the truth of the fact that I'm a wonderful person. That's not an apology when you get to that. So, from a magical perspective, your magic and your relationship with spirits is based on your personal ethics, whatever they happen to be. And your relationship with the universe is the most paramount thing. Your authority with the spirit beings and so forth that inhabit that part of the world comes from your integrity and your truthfulness and your willingness to be vulnerable and real and know who you are. That's where that authority really comes from. It's not an ego authority. It's not like I'm more powerful than you are, you have to do what I say kind of a thing. It's that I know who I am and you can't do that. That's not okay. And they're like, okay, you know who you are and that's not okay. I will back off now. So I don't know if this helps, um, but we have been having boundary issues. This is one of the reasons I'm bringing boundaries up. There's definitely, I'm being challenged. My boundaries are being challenged by someone who wants me to believe that they've become enlightened. And clearly they're not, because they have been so unenlightened that they think that they can continue to contact me and try to coerce me into giving them what they want. That doesn't work with me. I have good boundaries. And I hope that this helps you learn some for yourself if you need them. And if you have good boundaries, congratulate yourself, because I know how hard they are to get for some of us. And, acknowledge how far you've come, how well you're doing. Know that you will make mistakes because you're human and you don't know everything. And there's things you don't know that you don't know, and you won't know them until they come up. So be open to learning, and everything will work out okay in the end. Life is a series of challenges. That's what we have here. And it's okay to meet them however you want, but how you meet them determines what happens next. So anyway, this is Siofra Bradigan, and this has been Siofra's Magic Alcove. Blessed be.